Okay, I think we might just get started. So I'm Molly Shorthouse, who has been a rural generalist with advanced skills in mental health and psychiatry, mostly in Arnhem Land, but also a bit of time in Tasmania and Melbourne, Queensland, Papua New Guinea, as we rural doctors tend to do. The session was planned this morning with a bit more of a psychiatry focus, but having gone back, just come back to Arnhem Land after breaking Tassie, I was reminded again that actually the thing that matters most in working in Aboriginal communities, and not just in understanding mental health and psychiatry, but in working at all in Aboriginal communities, is understanding trauma-informed care. I thought I'd tell a story about when my whole lens changed about all of this. So it was 2015. I was in Gove Hospital. We have these morning handover meetings, which is the GP obs, GP anaesthetics, whoever was on the ward, whoever's on the weekend, whoever's at night time. We all sit around and talk and hand over who's on the wards at the moment. And the GP obstetricians were telling me a story about a younger woman who'd come in a week before. One of those stories that made me think, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not a GP obstetrician. And she'd had a baby at home, so no antenatal care, because she was in denial probably about being pregnant. She was rushed into the hospital by family, had massive postpartum hemorrhage, ended up in theatre, GP anaesthetics, neonatal resus. Just got mum through, just got bub through. Yeah, it's a week, maybe even 10 days later. She's doing all right, baby's doing all right. And they're talking about, but she's just not, she's just not paying any attention to this baby, and she's just not interested in this baby, and we've called territory families in. That's when my ears clicked up and I was, oh shit, no, don't, hang on. And I said, has anyone come up and done an assessment, done a full mental health assessment on this beautiful girl, Sam? And they said, we got the psych nurse in, who's very, very much in the psychiatric Western model of thinking. And but no, she said she's done this before. This is her third baby that she won't be interested in, is now in grandma's care. So I went up and sat with her. First of all, rang Dipperlinger, who's a strong woman out there, and asked if she'd come in with me, and also knew that she was the right kinship to come in and sit with us. And sure, Sam was just not attached at all. This baby was crying and she was not paying much attention. But she had that really vacant, flat affect, vacant stare. There was a lot more going on. There wasn't any obvious psychosis, so there wasn't responding. So Dibblinger and I spent a few days going in and out. And then one day we walked in there and she'd just come out of the shower, and this time she was responding, and Dipperlinger said, who's talking? And she was hearing male voices, and there were 3 male voices, so she was, straight away we went back into, okay, psychiatry, we've got a postnatal psychosis, gonna have to ring up the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne I was using at the time, the CL psychiatrist, get some advice, explain that I want the lowest possible dose of antipsychotic because she's an Aboriginal woman and she just had a baby. And then I went back down and sat with Dipperlinger, who again is a strong woman but also a very knowledgeable medical woman. And she said, no, Molly, those voices, they were the voices whenever she has a shower, because she was assaulted. And she was assaulted many times as a child, and when she has a shower, she hears those men. And I thought, oh, this is trauma. Okay, I've got to get these two worlds in my head again. And I started researching it as we do when we don't understand things, talking in Yolngu with Yolngu, but then researching what I could, and I started looking up what trauma does to the mind. And I found this course on trauma-informed care, and I thought, oh wow, better bring this up. It's $3,000 to get to Gove. NTPHN, I hope there's no one in the room, decided it wasn't relevant at the time and wouldn't fund it. So I paid $3,000 of my own money, just hoping that I'd get enough people in the room to pay $30 or $100 to get that money back. Otherwise we weren't going on a family holiday that year. And I did, but it was mostly teachers and some nurses in there, and they taught us about trauma. And ever since then, everything I've seen, I see through the lens of trauma, and I'm talking about not just mental health. I'm talking about diabetes, cardiovascular disease, everything. I see through the lens of trauma, and these two beautiful women next to me are the experts in it, both psychologists from AMSANT, who give a really important talk. So I'm so glad there's so many people here to see it. So Danielle Dyall is a proud Minjabul woman from Tweed Heads, here, mother of two beautiful boys. She's currently enrolled in a Masters of Public Health at CDU and has a bachelor degree in trauma and healing, Indigenous suicide studies, and a graduate diploma in public health. Danielle spent many years working closely with her community and a variety of projects and roles. Danielle's also always ensured she works in a culturally responsive and trauma-informed way. Danielle moved to the Northern Territory in 2016 and is currently working with AMSANT as a trauma-informed care and social emotional wellbeing leader. Sarah Haythornthwaite's family background is mixed English and Irish, and she feels fortunate to have grown up in the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people in Fremantle, WA. Sarah's worked as a clinical psychologist in a variety of community and mental health settings in the past 19 years. Sarah first moved to the NT with her family in 2008 to work with the Social Emotional Wellbeing Program at the Whirly Health Service in Katherine. In October 2011, Sarah commenced her role with AMSANT. Sarah's role with AMSANT involves being available to provide program support, clinical supervision, and those working in AAD, social emotional wellbeing and mental health in NT. And just before they start, I'll let you know that we got Sam back out to her homeland. We got her onto an almost homeopathic dose of antipsychotic. And now she's off with them all together. And she's back with all three children and very happy. So, off you go.
Thank you, Molly, for that lovely introduction. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians in the country that we are on. I'd like to acknowledge Larrakia country, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Larrakia traditional custodians and the Larrakia country itself, the elders of this land, past, the elders of the present, and also our emerging elders. I'd also like to acknowledge my ancestors, the Minjabul people, and all of my mother's ancestors as well. And I'd like to acknowledge my elders, and I'd like to acknowledge all of your ancestors as well, and all of your elders that sit within you, and the knowledge that guides you as well. So we know that we cannot live in the past, but the past lives in us. And this is a beautiful quote from Dr. Charles Perkins, who is an Aranda man. And it really depicts the trauma-informed care approach, the understanding of that circularity of time, and knowing that our experiences in life, the stories that we've gathered in life, is always informing and impacting on the way we perceive the world, the way we experience the world and the way we express ourselves in the world on a physical, psychological, emotional, social, cultural way. And very much in the way that Molly's just shared this story, so the experiences we have and how it impacts us. And this really represents the trauma-informed care approach, which is the mantra of trauma-informed care is not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. So looking at those stories of the past to be able to understand what's happening to the people that we're working with or who our clients are. So moving away from the pathologizing of a person, but really seeing for the person who they are and what they've experienced and how this has impacted them. Next. So this is the this is the social emotional wellbeing model, and this is how Indigenous people have long maintained that strong cultural identities are critical to health and wellbeing. So a group of psychologists, Aboriginal psychologists, went around the country and spoke to many communities and elders within those communities to talk about what does health and well-being mean for Aboriginal people. And this is what they came up with. And it's looking at those protective factors that keep us resilient and strong. And it's through the relationships that we have with life. And these relationships are those connections. So our connections to our body, connections to our mind and emotions, connections to family and kinship, connections to community, connections to culture, connections to country, connections to spirit, spirituality, and our ancestors. And when we have had experiences in life that keeps us connected and strong to all these protective factors, then the way we can express ourselves in the world is with strength and with resiliency. And that resiliency to the adverse experiences that we may have in life, we're able to protect ourselves. I'd also like to acknowledge that whilst for the past 200 years we've had policies and we've had things in place that has dismantled, undermined these connections, and so that we have become disconnected to these areas that keep us strong and keep us resilient to adverse experiences, we also have 60,000 years that is strong and is connected to this. So when working with Aboriginal people, we really need to put this into perspective, that whilst we have 200 years that has kept us disconnected to these areas, we've also got 60,000 years within us that still sits within us, understanding the trauma-informed approach, that it is the past that is informing the present. So there is 60,000 years there. So what is trauma? What do we mean by trauma? What is your understanding of trauma? What comes to mind without overthinking it when you hear the word trauma? So trauma originally is derived from the Greek word term wound, and historically we've thought of trauma as a physical wound or injury. But we also are now commonly using the word to describe the psychological, emotional, and spiritual wounding that is caused by events where we feel frightened, we feel that we are threatened and in danger, and we are completely overwhelmed with our capacity to cope, where we don't have the resources on hand to be able to cope with the threat or the danger. Also, an event that is traumatic for one person may not be for the next. So we need to consider a person's personal experiences. So consider the past experiences that a person has had. So what we may find not threatening or not dangerous for people who have had or have been wounded in these areas, then these people will have unresolved trauma around that experience. So the experience is accompanied by feelings of intense fear, where we are feeling completely overwhelmed and threatened, and we do not have the resources around us to be able to cope. There's also a complete lack or loss of control over the situation, so we have no control. And the nature of supports around us following the event is a key factor in determining how the impact of the experience on our psychological distress, which results if the traumatic event remains unresolved. So trauma affects a person's physical and emotional safety and can affect a person for decades and in many different ways. It's also important to recognise that trauma does stem from a very normal response to significant stresses within life. And this is what I was mentioning before around how that trauma is a normal experience. We have many traumatic experiences in life, or, difficult experiences in life. And when we have these difficult experiences, if we have the resources around us to be able to cope, then we can actually become empowered by those experiences and we learn from them. And it's where we can find our own power and strength. So difficult experiences that are traumatic is really important to have, but what is important is to have those resources. If we don't have those resources, that's when we feel overwhelmed and we can't cope, and that's when that psychological, emotional distress continues. The responses to, trauma can be described in different ways. There's different types of trauma. So there's acute trauma, which is a single or isolated event. So that could be a car crash. And so it's just single and isolated. We then have complex trauma, which is the trauma that's the sort of the work that I'm involved with, is that complex trauma, which is often characterised by interpersonal trauma. So it happens through relationship. It is early life onset, and it's when it's ongoing. So the experiences of trauma are ongoing, and it has severe impacts, particularly developmentally, and it becomes compounded as the trauma keeps going over the years. There's also secondary exposure, and this occurs through bearing witness to past traumatic experiences of family and community members, and this is particularly important to Aboriginal people as a result of colonisation, forced removals and other government policies. Secondary exposure is also particularly relevant for Aboriginal people, where the structure is collective and relational. So when a person or community experiences a trauma, the whole community will be affected. When thinking of solutions and strategies for Aboriginal people who work collectively, it is really important to provide a solution that's not just looking at the individual, because we are collective people. So we need to think of the whole family and the communities that are also being affected. A key consequence of secondary exposure to traumatic experiences is intergenerational trauma. So this is a form of historical trauma that is transmitted across generations. Trans-intergenerational trauma affects populations that have experienced cumulative and collective trauma over multiple generations, and children within these families may exhibit signs and symptoms of trauma such as depression, grief or guilt, anxiety, even if they have not personally experienced the traumatic event themselves. Whoops, wrong way. So how trauma affects the brain, how it impacts the brain on our emotions and how we cope in the world. So within our brain there are various systems which govern their own set of functions. They work in synergy with each other, and they are integrated parts that then inform how we regulate our physical, biological system, how we relate within the world, psychologically and socially, and how we reason cognitively. When a person experiences anything of intense fear or feel threatened, then the brain triggers the sympathetic nervous system, which then has a whole chemical response throughout the body, which prepares the person to protect oneself, known as the fight or flight or freeze response. And this is a very normal response that everyone goes through. However, for people with complex trauma, it's like this response is constantly being turned on. It's constantly being triggered. So basically what happens is the emotion fear is felt. That's the first thing that happens, is the emotion fear. And it's in the amygdala, which governs the emotions, and that's part of the limbic system. Then the emotion fear is felt, and then the cortex, which is that higher executive functioning, which is part of reasoning, decision making, abstract thought, that goes offline because it's not needed in a time of threat. It is completely bypassed until the person is able to regulate themselves again, and that's about getting that cortex back online again for that reasoning to happen. The adrenal glands are triggered and they release stress hormones throughout the whole body. And for people who with complex trauma, these stress hormones can be going through the body. Their body's been bathed in these hormones, and it's really toxic to the body over long periods of time. The blood is removed from organs that are not needed in the fight or flight response or freeze response. So it can be removed from the digestive system, and it goes to organs where it is needed to be able to be really strong, to have that aggression and that to be able to fight that threat, or to be able to run away as fast as you can. However, if you're completely overwhelmed and you just aren't able to respond, then you freeze, and there's that withdrawal response. So we can see that for people, when this response is happening over a long period of time, then those organs aren't receiving the nutrients that they're meant to be receiving. They're not receiving the oxygen that it's meant to have. And so that's when we start to see those comorbidities like heart disease or diabetes. And we also see those mental health issues such as aggression, anxiety, and withdrawal. And this part of this story is also how our memories work, which draws upon association. So this is within our hippocampus, and basically whenever we have a new experience, we go back to our hippocampus and we look at all our past experiences so that we can then draw from those the association of what's happening right now. So it helps us look from our past experiences to be able to perceive the reality and understand what's happening right now in this moment. So people who have complex trauma and have a history of where life is dangerous, where they are feeling threatened, when they're having a new experience, they're going back to their past experiences, and then that can inform that right now we could be under threat, that life is dangerous, that it's not safe, and therefore it kicks on the fight or flight response, and that's how that fight or flight response for people with complex trauma, it's turned up for them. And there's lots of triggers because of the association, how we associate with the past to be able to understand what's happening with the present. And that's within the hippocampus, which is also part of the limbic system. We can also understand that emotions are timeless. There's no time to emotions, and I'd just like to try something with you. I'd like to invite you all to just think back to a really good experience that you've had in your life. You can maybe close your eyes or just soften your gaze and just start to just remember a really good experience that you had where you felt completely happy, where you felt safe. Who were the people that were part of this experience? What was happening in this time where you were really happy and felt really connected? Feel those feelings. Feel that happiness, that joy. As you can feel that feeling, we can see that emotions are timeless. How we can be feeling that experience from the past right now in this room together. However, for people who have that complex trauma, they don't have the same strong emotions that we may have. Instead, there's the feelings of loss and grief and fear, and that sits inside them, and it can happen right in this moment, and it affects the whole system.
So as Danielle has just explained, we can see that when we understand the impact that complex childhood trauma has on the developing brain and body and emotional systems of children, it helps us to understand how those experiences connect with some of the most complex mental health, substance use, but also other health issues that people experience in later life. Some people might be familiar with this study. It's probably one of the most significant studies that's been done in this area. It's the ACE study that was done in America in the mid-1990s. It involved surveying approximately 17,500 adults and looking at the relationship between adverse childhood experiences to health issues throughout life, and basically looked at the correlation between those experiences. So they were looking at childhood experiences that were considered to be severe and threatening. So things like childhood abuse. Also, an adverse childhood experience was defined as growing up in a household where there was domestic violence, or an adult struggling with a mental health issue or a substance use issue. Those were the sorts of things. So things that we would consider to be experiences of childhood trauma. And basically what this study illustrated, first of all, was that, as Danielle has also mentioned, that adverse experiences are common in life. More than half of the respondents had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. It also showed really clearly what they called like a dose relationship. So basically the number of adverse childhood experiences that people had a graded relationship to the presence of adult diseases. So, for example, people with 7 or more traumatic experiences in childhood were significantly more at risk of 7 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US. So, and 7 or more adverse childhood experiences resulted in 3 times the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease. We also see that for people who had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, they were 4.5 times the risk of depression and 12 times the risk of attempting suicide. I think it's really important to note that, of course, they took into consideration, the researchers took into consideration the increased risk of high-risk behaviours in life following adverse childhood experiences, but they clearly demonstrated that even when there weren't high-risk behaviours in life, such as drinking and smoking, following these early childhood experiences, these increased risk of mental health and health issues remained. And basically what they showed was that with 7 or more early childhood experiences of trauma, it explained a 20-year difference in life expectancy, those people compared to people who'd had no childhood experiences of trauma. So something, when Danielle and I have been doing this work with our health services and with other organisations, we always like to emphasise that sometimes some of these complex health and mental health issues get talked about as if they're Aboriginal issues. And we always think it's really important to put this in the context of trauma, that these are the issues that we connect to early childhood experiences of trauma, which is regardless of our cultural backgrounds. So just to put this in a bit of perspective of our local context, in 2008, Larrakia Nation did a really interesting study where they surveyed people living in the long grass. So these are people in Darwin who often come from remote communities. They've come to Darwin perhaps for medical issues, perhaps for legal issues, for family issues, and they end up living in the long grass. Basically, as part of that survey where they were talking to these people, they also used the Australian Aboriginal version of the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire to assess what had been the lifetime experiences of trauma for this population of people. They found that on average, the participants who took part in this survey had experienced 12 trauma events throughout their lives. And 10 of those were direct experiences of trauma, not just witnessing or being close to an experience of trauma. So obviously, looking at these statistics, it's quite striking how that compares to what we know about that impact of early childhood experiences or childhood experiences through the ACE study. And just to give some examples, these are some of the experiences that people living in the long grass said that they had had throughout their lives. So 3/4 of the participants had had a direct experience of forced segregation from family, identified as having bad experiences with alcohol or other drugs, and other unresolved emotional or physical or spiritual health issues. And more than half of the participants, some of the things that are quite striking is more than half had experienced the murder of a family member or friend, and more than half had actually witnessed the murder of a stranger by strangers. So really putting into context the role of trauma in some of the communities that we're working with. So basically from the ACE study, it really highlighted that in terms of dealing with and preventing some of our most complex mental health and health issues, it highlighted the importance of preventing the occurrence of early childhood experiences of trauma. We also know that for a lot of people who've, one of the defining features of complex trauma is that it often occurs within close relationships, within the close network of people caring for the child. And often through those experiences, children, part of that is that they don't learn healthy ways of, well, in fact, part of how it impacts the brain is that people struggle to make sense of their emotional experience and then struggle to find ways to better manage their emotional experiences and aren't necessarily supported to find healthy coping strategies. Thus, this connection with some of those high-risk behaviours, such as substance use issues that people lean on. So we also understand that in terms of preventing some of those complex health issues which follow from early childhood experiences, supporting people to develop healthy ways of making sense of their emotional experiences, coping with their emotional experiences, preventing the adoption of those health risk behaviours is a really key component of supporting better health for people who've had those experiences. I think that kind of makes that last point.
And so as Sarah was just mentioning then about finding those healthy ways to be able to cope with those the exposure of ACEs or those adverse life experiences. And this is what I was talking a little bit about before around how when we go into that fight or flight response, the first thing we need to do is start to regulate. We need to come back into regulation. And then from there, from just being able to regulate and to feel safe and supported, we can then start relating again and making sense through that relating and finding reason and making sense of the situation. But the first thing that needs to happen is that regulation. And so Bruce Perry has been able to look at this is Bruce Perry's work, who's a psychiatrist in America, and he's done some really interesting work in looking at the brain and that neuroscience and seeing how the brain is developing still right from when the babies are still in the womb, and those areas within the brain that has their own particular functions. And then he's been able to identify what activities we do with our babies and with our children that help those neural pathways within their brain have to have optimal function and for their function to be optimal. So he's identified within the brainstem that the brainstem is the first area of the brain that's developing, and it's all rhythmic function. So it's things like arousal regulation. It's also things like the heartbeat, having a strong, steady heartbeat, as well as sleep patterns as well. And when we look at what happens for babies is that the first thing is they're in the amniotic fluid, and so they're constantly being rocked in the amniotic fluid. And then we also when the baby's born, we're rocking the baby and we're doing that eye gazing with the baby, and that actually helps form that brainstem and help the neural pathways within the brainstem to then be able to have that strong arousal regulation, to be able to have a strong heartbeat, and to be able to have the sleep. Within the midbrain as well, which is that sort of thalamus section, which is just above the brainstem that connects into the limbic system. That's the sort of more complex movement, and then he's identified that music, movement and touch has been what helps develop that area. For the limbic system, as I was saying before, that's the amygdala, where we regulate emotions. It's where we have that attachment and where we develop empathy, and the activities, and that's part of that relating. And so the activities that you see children is the dance, the play, the art, the nature discovery, or connecting to country. And so it's those activities that actually help with that brain function. And then for the cortex, which is abstract reasoning, creativity, the decision making, that's storytelling, drama, and exposure to performing. Now, what Bruce Perry also was able to identify, that whilst this is really good for the development of the brain, when the brain has been compromised by trauma and hasn't developed normally, because of brain plasticity, if we do these activities even later in life as an adult, over, that's quite repetitive. It can't be just the one-off. It has to be repetitive and over a period of time. Then it actually can start to reshape the brain and reshape it in a way so that it can start functioning, and adults can start to find that those processes that help to regulate and reason and relate. Coming back to this model, if we just looked at all those activities that Bruce Perry has identified in not only helping to support the development of the brain, but also to support the renewal of the brain after trauma, these are all these same activities that within Indigenous societies all over the world has been part of their way of life. So ceremony, connecting to country, the art, the corroboree, which is part of the storytelling, and the drama. It's all these things that we've done which has been able to support us and protect us from the adverse life experiences, and we are now being able to prove the effects that this actually has on supporting brain function. So I think that when we're especially working with Indigenous people, we're really good at this stuff. And so when working with Indigenous people, just to keep that in mind, that these are the things that also help to renew the brain after trauma. So, coming to trauma-informed care, which is what Molly originally started the session with, this is an approach. Trauma-informed care is based on a set of principles which enables a service to enhance their knowledge of how trauma may impact on a person who is accessing the services. So we become more informed, and when we realise the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. Recognise the sign and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff and others involved with the system. And so coming back to Molly's story, when she recognised that what was happening for this young woman was actually trauma, so recognising those symptoms and the signs so that we can actually start putting in place a care strategy that is going to support that. So by responding, by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures and practices to resist re-traumatisation of clients and staff. And again, coming back to the history of Indigenous people and working in the public health system, when we look at the history of what the public health system has played on for Aboriginal people, and even within psychologists who, around the stolen generation and that removal of children. So we've got to be really mindful of what the history that our service or the institutions that we work from has played on Aboriginal people, and be really mindful of that to resist the re-traumatisation of clients and staff, and to rebuild connection to our communities, to our family and kin, to our country's culture, body, mind and spirituality. So these are the 5 R's of trauma-informed care. And this is developed by, it was originally developed by SAMHSA, the adverse, do you know that?
The mental health support services.
Yeah, the mental health support services, but it has been adapted by Judy Atkinson as well.
Yeah, so Judy Atkinson is an Australian Aboriginal woman who's done a lot of work in supporting trauma-informed service delivery, and we've worked closely in her in some of the work that we've been doing, worked closely with her in some of the work we've been doing in the Territory. So basically for services and organisations to become trauma-informed, that process is understood to occur on a continuum. So supporting services, and you can imagine part of the process is exactly what we're doing today. A large part of the process is just starting to have these conversations with people working in community and with clients to raise trauma awareness, to raise an understanding of how trauma impacts on people and how that connects to some of these issues that we're grappling with. And then supporting services to move through to being more trauma sensitive and kind of reflective in their practices and their system design, towards being trauma responsive, so actually responding to the underlying trauma of the issues that we're seeing. And then this kind of ideal of trauma-informed integration throughout services and systems. And the process by which services and organisations undergo this is understood to be like a continual quality improvement process. So it's kind of ongoing.
And the research is showing that to reach trauma integration, it can take about 3 years. So to get through this process, and this is the Missouri model, which comes from the States. So this is the CQI method that we use, so the continuous quality improvement. And as we've been saying, it's a top-down, bottom-up approach. So it impacts and all levels within the organisation. So all knowledge areas, all systems within the organisation, and all policies. And there's a audit tool that is used, and then that audit tool helps to identify and assess the organisation to then determine where the change needs to take place. And it's the principles of trauma-informed care is wrapped around those areas. So looking at where within the organisation they might be already really strong with those principles, but then other areas that could be strengthened, and that's that assessment that can happen, or the audit tool that is used. And these are the core principles to trauma-informed care. And these, like we've mentioned, is these principles become embedded within all areas of an organisation. So understanding trauma and its impacts, which is what we've been discussing, creating environments in which clients and community members feel physically, emotionally and spiritually safe. And this is so important for people who have experienced trauma, or when a person is feeling trauma, is safety. That's the first thing we need to establish, is safety, before anything else is going to occur, any sort of relationship is going to occur. As we've said, that trauma happens by relationship or through relationship, while healing and support is also through relationship. And before we can start that relationship, we need to feel safe. Culturally competent staff. So staff respect specific cultural backgrounds, but it's not just about respecting specific cultural backgrounds, it's also about understanding your own cultural background, being completely aware and informed of how your cultural background has developed. What does it mean? Where do our worldviews come from? How have they been formed? And how is it impacting on the way that we are relating with other people? And then understanding those other cultural backgrounds in in the way that we're all relating with one another. Empowering and supporting clients' control. And like we said earlier on, when we have experienced trauma, we lose complete control. So if we continue to take that control away from the clients that we're working with, then that is re-traumatizing them, or that's also confirming that their world is unsafe. So it's about empowering and supporting that control for the clients, which comes into the sharing power and governance, including individuals and families in the design and delivery of programs. Integrating and coordinating care to holistically meet the needs of individuals, families and communities. And that's like that model of social emotional wellbeing, where we're all integrated human beings, all parts of us are integrated, and so is the things that we need in life. It all should be integrated and not siloed, and that coordinated care. Support relationship buildings and connections as a means to promoting healing, which is what I was saying just before. And to always, always know that recovery is possible, and to look at how to enable that recovery. So these are the principles of trauma-informed care. And that pretty much comes to the end of our session. I'll finish with this actually. This is a poem that's written by Udjuru Nunakul, Kath Walker, who's from Stradbroke Island, and her grandson, Dennis, was a songman for a cultural group that I was a part of back home. And these are his children, and they started off as little bubs, and then as they grew up, they also started singing and playing didge for many audiences. It was sort of part of the Byron Bay area, so there's lots of festivals that go on down there, and so we were invited to a lot of festivals to sing and dance. And it was just so beautiful to see these young kids just feeling so empowered and strong to be able to sing and do this in front of thousands of people. But this is the poem from their grandmother. My son, your troubled eyes search mine, puzzled and hurt by coloured line. Your black skin as soft as velvet shine, what can I tell you, son of mine? I could tell you of heartbreak, hatred blind, I could tell you of crimes that shame mankind, of brutal wrongs and deeds malign, of rape and murder, son of mine. But I'll tell you instead of brave and fine, when lives of black and white entwine, and man in brotherhood combine, this would I tell you, son of mine. Thank you.
So just before we start with some questions and discussions about all of that, I'm so glad there's so many people in the room. What was it? Okay. Oh, there isn't a second session where this is all at once. Yeah, okay. So I just want you to think again about that ACE study. That was a huge, huge study in America by a paediatrician. It's really, really well validated. If you haven't gone and looked it up, go and look it up. If you're thinking about what Donna Archie said yesterday, that the gap is widening, you think about the 20 years that happens from that early childhood trauma. The reason I've got so obsessed with this and why I love having these guys here and I want to spread this message is if we don't look after that first 10 years, if we don't all start thinking about trauma and mental health and safety and social and emotional well-being in these communities, then doesn't matter what you do with your diabetes medication or your cardio or your ACE inhibitor or anything. So that was one point. The other thing I just wanted to say is in our community in Arnhem Land recently we've had 3 youth suicides, so 15, 17, 20. We've also had a group of about 30 kids sniffing and they've got quite significant organic brain damage as a result. We also have had a young group of kids having very sexualised behaviour, which I don't know if you know is actually a sign of, can happen from FASD. And I went to the school and I said to the principal, and it's a bilingual school, so she's a younger woman, and I said, what can we do? Give me a list of names of how I can help and who we can see and what we can do. And she gave me a list of 100 kids. And I said, hang on, what were your criteria to put these names down? She said, basically, she said, either someone in that house has committed suicide, they've mentioned it themselves, they've seen it, just severe trauma of 100 kids. So we decided to organise a community meeting, and I spread the word that if it wasn't more than 50% Yolngu in the room, it wasn't a quorum and would shut it down, which was a big risk because I invited like 100 people and some people had flown in, and we got more than 50% Yolngu. And I just wanted to read a couple of the things that some of the elders said because it was really powerful stuff. This is from Jawa Barrawonga. We are mothers, grandmothers, uncles for our children. Our kids are crying. There is shame on us with white man looking after our kids. The kids are in pain. Our kids are waiting for us to learn. We're nurses, doctors, scientists. There's no leadership in our Yolngu areas anymore. We're broken. We're broken because of this external justice system. Our power was taken when our town was taken. Nhulunbuy was taken. We fought and the government didn't listen. And then I'll just read one more. And then Mandy Wanamora said, if we took a photo in the 1970s, 50s, 60s, you'll see Yolngu were doing everything. This was taken from us. Balanda law came in taking this from us, taking our ability to discipline our children. I can speak, that's all. Then the police come. The power has been taken from me to help my children. Law and government and lots of others will come over and take over my role. This is a man who's one of the most senior elders in Arnhem Land, who's been through every initiation ceremony and to hear these sorts of words. So when I get authority from the elders, I'm going to get these minutes out because there's some really powerful stuff in that. And I think that's why I'm so glad that you guys have come and listened. Did anyone want to ask any questions?
Yeah, hi, I'm Louise Stone. I do a fair bit of trauma-informed care, and I'm curious what strengths you could bring from your context to help the people who work in it, because I've seen so many people who've burned out in this sort of circumstance through vicarious trauma. I'm just wondering how you support your carers, your health professionals.
We've been doing this work across a variety of organisations now, and what comes to mind is we actually did some training with people working in Territory Families recently, and the conversation we had with them, I'm not sure if this answers the question or not, but we were talking about, understanding of how we become traumatised, how that psychological distress continues in us following an event. A key component of that is when it outstrips the coping resources that we have available to us. And we all know that, as we say, trauma is a part of life, and if we have a lot of support around us, we manage through those traumatic experiences, and they don't necessarily stay in us in a way that causes problems in our lives. So I think the key message for those of us working in this area is we have to pay special attention to the support that we have around us, because when we have enough support around us, we are able to manage through really difficult circumstances. And the more difficult the circumstances, the more important the support, and the more important that we prioritise having time for that and really putting effort into that for ourselves, just as it is for the people that we work with. The other thing that comes to mind is this lovely research that's now emerging in the Western literature about how traditional practices have been so key in supporting healthy brain development and in supporting healing and recovery. And I think just as the process of colonisation has to some extent, disconnected people from some of those practices. So it is for us from non-Aboriginal backgrounds. We were the people who brought our stories of trauma to the land and acted it out on the people of this country. And, I've got Celtic origins. I'm pretty disconnected from my Celtic dance and songs and traditions, which, we have certain ways of thinking about those things, but finally, Western mental health is kind of catching up to an understanding of those practices are key to our well-being, and dance and song and ceremony is vital. So they're the other things I think we need to think about in terms of how we care for ourselves.
And I think as well, like Sarah said, it's the responsibility that we take on for ourselves, but it's also the responsibility of the organisations that we work with as well. And having some really strong self-care strategies within the organisation, within the policies, to have a self-care policy that supports the staff is really important as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks, that was great. With the first woman that you were talking about who was hearing the voices in the shower, as GPs, if we recognise that someone that's the main cause of their presentation, do we refer to somebody who's an expert in this, or are there things that we can do? I guess acknowledging it and being kind but are there other practical things we can do besides referring, or do you think referring's the best option?
I mean, yeah, it's a matter of safety, and I think, in this case, I spoke to two experts, and one was the maternal psychiatrist in the Royal Melbourne, and the other was a strong woman, Dibblinger, and then put those two together. But I think in general practice, I guess it depends on the population as well. If it is an Aboriginal population, then just to be mindful of how different that worldview is, and that hearing voices and seeing your ancestors, and that's actually not psychosis a lot of the time. So yeah, exactly, yeah. So I think it's a really good question. I'd make sure I always ask the two experts, the cultural one and the... Yeah.
Molly, I was curious about that meeting. Presumably it was at Yirrkala and at the school there. That narrative of loss of power from the elders. Are there any sort of structures that exist at the moment where those people have a voice for their community, or is it something that has been facilitated by MeWatch or other organisations?
Good question, and that's what really came out of that meeting. And actually, Tamsin from PHN was in there, and she was quite overwhelmed, and she sort of came out and said, "Oh my God, we've got to stop doing this silo funding and just give Aboriginal medical organisations the money and let them make their own mind up." Exactly. I don't know if it'll get over the line, but that's how powerful the elders were talking, and I think that's really what my goal will be to create over the next few years. We talked about this concept of collective impact. So what we're going to try to do, youth social emotional wellbeing is not just a health thing. Obviously, it's social, it's sports, it's just society, it's mum, dad, grandpa. So what we want to do is we want to take it out of just the health service. I don't know, in Alice Springs there's this careless model, which is quite a good one. So it's a whole group that look after youth. It's about 10 different Aboriginal organisations. I think that's probably a good way, and they feel empowered then. And I think that's going to be the really big thing that I want to be able to do there. So I don't have the exact answer. You guys might have an idea about how to empower that one.
Are these people received well by the community, or are they ignored? Do they still have a voice within their own community, do you think?
Within their community? Oh, absolutely. These are the voices of... they were the powerful elders all in the room. The men on one side, women on the other, as often happens, and men talking too much and women getting annoyed at them, and then women saying the wise things. And but we're going to have this meeting hopefully once a month, and I think because it was majority, you know, there's a lot of times you've got to admit where there's a bunch of white people in a room talking about Aboriginal people and making decisions, and it's just got to stop. And this was the first time that there was way more young in the room that were talking about this, and so we're going to, in Arnhem Land, I'm sure it's happened lots of other places, but we're going to try to keep doing it every month and keep it going, and just listen and let them make the decisions.
Yeah, and I think this is just value adding to what Molly has already said, but I guess it's just about, the strong Indigenous leadership. And when there is strong Indigenous leadership, you can really see the difference within communities and the health and well-being of communities. And like Molly's saying, is when you empower that Indigenous leadership and you give that a voice, then there's going to be some really good outcomes, health outcomes from that. So I think Indigenous leadership is really important.
Any other question?
Yes, Molly, very well done so far. I think you're definitely on the right track. But I'd just like to add one little thing that I observed from my time on the Tiwi Islands. And I can only say that everything you've said here applied there equally as well with the trauma. But there was an added trauma on the Tiwis, which was fairly unique. And that was that the Tiwi people were taken over by the Catholic, the nuns, and looked after by the nuns. And unbeknownst to anyone, they lost their feeling language. They completely lost their feeling language. And this became obvious to me, and I mentioned it to one of the nuns and one of the priests, and the priest got very, very defensive about it. And I wasn't trying to say it in a way of being judgmental, just to say that, look, they were losing their inner support from their own families because they couldn't express their feelings to each other. And I forget who was the psychiatrist that we got to come in, and she started drawing picture books and pictures where people could actually relate to a picture as to how their feeling was. But just to say that this is an added part to the trauma, and when you haven't got that as part of your solution, it becomes even more difficult to control.
Yeah. So some of the stuff that Yirrkala School, after I got that course up in 2016, they've been putting trauma-informed care into the school, and they used to have what do they call it? It's like when the school has to shut down, lockdown, because a child's behaviour is so dangerous that all the other kids have to hide, and they have to hide away from the glass, and there's a special system. They used to have a lockdown pretty much once a week because these are kids with a lot of trauma, you know. And they've been doing 2 years of trauma-informed care in that school, and they haven't had a lockdown now for 6 months. And they've made massive, massive improvements. Now, there's still really kids that need a lot of help there, but their organisational reaction to these kids has made that difference. So I think if there's anything that we can take away is just get these guys to come to your organisation if you're in the Territory, or if you've got something similar around Australia, make sure it's trauma-informed. It's going to make a big difference to Aboriginal health. Yeah.
And just commenting back on what you were saying then around using pictures, because when people are being triggered and in that reactive fight or flight mode, language is not even there. People cannot use language at that time because the cortex is offline. So there's no language to be able to understand and make sense of what's going and make sense of their feelings and their emotions. So using pictures or using that art or anything that's sort of not involving language is what is needed to be able to then regulate and bring that cortex back online to then make sense of what's happening. So yeah, that's right.
Anyone else?
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming.